All right, y'all, welcome to our lecture on the end of World War II. We've already made it to the end of this war, and if you are sad about that, fear not, because next year in US history, you'll get to learn all about this war in even greater detail. So, to begin, we are going to talk about the end of the war first in Europe, in the European theater, and then we'll shift over to the Pacific theater because that is how it happened for our Allied and Axis powers. On May 8th, 1945, the Germans officially surrendered to the Allied powers. This is after the Battle of the Bulge, in which the Allied powers had pushed the Nazis and the main Axis powers that were left back to Berlin. At this point, you're going to see Hitler and many of the leaders unalive themselves, leaving the German forces behind, who then officially surrendered to the Allied powers, and thus the war in the European theater is ended on May 8th, 1945, which if you're ever in Europe on that day, it is still a day of celebration. This also means that Allied forces now are going to focus all of their energy to the Pacific, and that's specifically going to be the Americans. And to a lesser extent, we'll see the British and the Soviets also sending their forces as well. But for all intents and purposes, in Europe, the war is over. A few months later, we are going to see the war end in Japan, and that is going to be on VJ Day. So VE Day, victory in Europe, VJ Day, victory Japan. That date for Japan will be September 2nd, 1945, when the war finally comes to a close. This is after the horrific battles of Okinawa and Iwo Jima, in which hundreds of thousands of soldiers died, and then the bombings by the Americans on Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9th. It cannot be expressed. It is hard to fully fathom just the massive amount of desecration and destruction. These are images of Hiroshima. You can see here on this map, all of these are buildings before, and then it is completely flattened as if things had never existed. This is one of the few buildings that remains, and if you ever go to Hiroshima, they've made this into a peace memorial. It is very powerful and very worthwhile visiting. And you can see down here as well, this is kind of a 360 photographing of just the utter destruction. Beyond the physical destruction of the buildings, we also see the immense, it is hard to even fully comprehend just the immense loss of life. So in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, on those days, more than 140,000 people are killed immediately from the blast. They're dropped at, I want to say like 8:45 in the morning, etc. And immediately you have more than 140,000 people who just immediately die. And in the weeks and months later, another 150 to 240,000, nearly 250,000 people die from radiation poisoning and disease following the droppings of these bombs of Little Boy and Fat Man. And again, you'll learn more about this in US history. And if your teacher does not teach you about this, you should demand to learn because it is a very important event. It's the only time that we've seen atomic weapons used. I hope it is the only time that we ever see atomic weapons used. It's one of the reasons why our nation and other countries are always concerned about rogue states getting their hands on nuclear weapons. Because in the hands of a government that does not respect human life and values, it can become very dangerous and very frightful. So after these bombs were dropped, the Japanese, who had been very dedicated to fighting, to continuing to advocate for their success, they realized that they are literally outweaponed because the United States is the only country that has a nuclear weapon at this time. Note that means at this time. It will not be for for a long time. But at this point, the Americans are the only ones that own and are able, and have used nuclear weapons. We're no longer the only ones that have nuclear weapons, but we are still the only ones who have used them. But after that, the Japanese realized that they cannot defeat the Allied powers, and they informally surrender on August 15th, and then officially sign the surrender treaties on September 2nd. And the war in the Pacific theater ends, which means World War II has officially ended. It lasted 6 years and 1 day from September 1st, 1939 until September 2nd, 1945. and the war is over. But despite the fact of the war being over, the effects of the war are going to be felt for years and decades following, as the costs of this war are immense. 70 to 85 million people died during this war. Majority of them are civilians. And you can see there on the little graphic over here, the majority of civilians, majority of people who died primarily came from the Soviet Union and China, followed by many other states in Europe as well as in Asia. You also see Germany losing a large number of loss of life as well. One of the reasons why we see so much loss of life in specifically the Soviet Union is one, because they had such a large population to begin with, but also due to military tactics such as scorched earth. Remember, as the Axis powers were advancing through the Soviet Union on their way to Moscow and Stalingrad, the Soviets practiced a policy of scorched earth policy, meaning that they were destroying everything as they retreated. They would burn everything in their wake, leaving no resources behind for the advancing Axis powers. That also meant that there were no resources left behind for the people who lived in the countryside. So the immense amount of civilian casualties was just unfathomable. This is not surprising because we know Stalin is not one to be concerned for life and people. Remember, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic, and we really see Stalin perpetuating that in this war. One could argue that was to be successful in this war. There's a lot to unpack about that. Just to also give you a sense, this is 3% of the global population this time. We were around like 2.3 billion or so. So this is roughly around 3% of the population, which is just massive. Majority of people are dying due to disease, famine, and the collateral damage of the bombings and the battles. So people that lived in cities where there were bombings, such as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as throughout Europe, as we'll see, as well as the diseases of not having clean water, not having food, not having medicine. All of that leads to massive, massive death. And then things like scorched earth policy is another element that leads to such massive death. It's also important to remember that this is another example of total war. Every continent is affected. When I was looking up casualty rates, etc., literally every single country from Malta to San Marino to Indonesia to Senegal, all of these countries lost life, had casualties, were affected by World War II. So again, that total war, that governments are devoting all of their resources and are totally affected by this war. This was unavoidable. For 6 years, this was people's entire lives. There was, while they might be doing other things like going on to college and school, etc., you could not ignore this war. You were hearing about it constantly. You knew people who were serving. You knew people lost their life. You knew people who were affected. It was unavoidable. It's not something that we have experienced since, and it's something, again, that I hope that we avoid. And I think with technology, we'll never have a war like this again. But it is important to understand just how immense the impact of this war was and what that meant for the world then and after. Looking a little more infrastructurally with the effects of this war, we see that many cities are destroyed by bombs in the battles, and that's happening in Europe, as we'll see first, and then we'll follow up with Asia. This meant for people, they lost electricity, water, food, all the things that you need to survive. If you remember going back to health, think about Maslow's hierarchy, those basic things that you need to survive. It's becoming few and far between for many people throughout Europe. In addition, we're seeing a lot of famine, so that's mass starvation, and that's due to the fact that many agriculture regions, farms are destroyed by bombings, as well as by the movement of armed forces. We're still seeing the majority of armed forces being moved through trains, through jeeps, and like cars and whatnot, as well as through airplane, and that also has an impact on the environment. So because these armies are having to travel great distances, and because battles are literally happening across the entire continent of Europe, as well as North Africa and Western Asia and the Middle East, you are seeing the impact on people throughout the entire region. Here's another map. This is actually of the 2.7 million bombings of the Allied powers in Europe, primarily targeting the Axis powers, Axis countries, as well as the Axis areas of control. If you remember when we learned about the Battle of Britain and some of the first strategies that the Axis powers used successfully, such as the Blitz, we see similar maps that illustrate all the bombings that occurred in Great Britain. So these bombings were massive, and again, not just the impact of if people did survive that, but many people did not, but also think about the psychological trauma and torture, because again, this is air delivered terror. This is not just affecting you in the sense of your belongings and materials, etc. It's also affecting you in the psychological sense that people do not feel safe. There is nowhere to hide. And that sense of lack of security is something that many people carry with them from this wartime, as well as into the Cold War era that we'll see in the decades that follow. And finally, looking at the social political effects in Europe, we also see people themselves. Millions of people, approximately 30 million, become displaced persons. These are people that essentially become refugees because they have nowhere to go back to. Their homes have been destroyed, their cities, their towns have been destroyed. They literally have no place to return. These are people that were captured as prisoners of war during the conflict. These are people that were taken by Axis and Allied powers. And this is also those that survived the concentration camp. We know that 11 million people were killed in the Nazi concentration camps. And for those that survived, as the Allied powers came and as the Axis powers were either releasing prisoners or they were being freed by the Soviets and the Americans, once they were freed, now they were displaced because their homes were destroyed, and especially for the Jews, their homes were destroyed, their belongings were looted, their homes were taken over. They literally had nothing to return to, and many of them did not want to return because of the horrors that had been perpetuated for them leading up to this terrible time in human history. So we see a lot of displacement. And finally, we also see our governments are having to rebuild, not just beyond the fact that they have been focusing their energy for the past 6 years on war efforts. Again, this is a total war, so governments are distributing their economy to the war efforts, all their infrastructure and their machinery, etc. They are largely building materials for war, and now they need to change gears. They need to now focus their energies on producing consumer goods once again. And our governments are having to rebuild literally the infrastructure. Many of the places that were destroyed, they have to rebuild the buildings and the roads and the waterways and all the things that we exist in a society that we have that make our world function. These governments are having to rebuild them following the war. And we also see that countries are literally having to rebuild their governments as well, as many countries had been annexed or invaded by the Axis powers. You can see this map in red. All of these countries that were red, lighter red and orange shadows here, these are all countries that had been taken over by Axis powers or were part of the Axis powers. So after the war, they must now create new governments. That's going to lead to quite a bit of instability and conflict. And we will see a bit more of that instability and conflict when we come back to looking at the world and the start of the Cold War. All right, so that's a little bit about Europe. We're going to see the same things that happen, same themes happen in Asia as well. So in Japan, we saw many cities were destroyed, specifically Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. This is actually Nagasaki before August 9th, and this is Nagasaki after. And again, just the immense devastation, destruction. It is unfathomable. So these bombing raids by the Allied powers leads to a lot of destruction and devastation. So the Japanese government must rebuild. The Japanese government must also restructure its own government. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the upcoming weeks. But it's important to note that just like we saw with the Axis powers in Europe, the Japanese government must also now create a new government. And spoiler alert, the Americans are going to play a very large role in that. And that's a little teaser for our next unit to see just what America does in Japan and in the rest of Asia following World War II. But before we get to that, we need to understand a little bit more about what's going on in that region. So another thing to remember is that during World War II, Japan was very successful in those first years, from the Sino-Japanese War bleeding into World War II. By the height of their powers in 1942, they control over 1 million square miles of land, of area. So they're controlling Japan, the Korean Peninsula, northeastern China. They're controlling French Indochina, which will be Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, Thailand, Burma, Malaya, Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, Taiwan. All of these areas are under Japanese control. So when the war is over, now these countries, which had been previously the majority colonies of European powers, now they are left to trying to create new governments. European powers are going to try to want to recolonize, and that's going to be a whole situation. But we're talking about France, we're talking about, we're talking about China, Indonesia, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, as we've said, they've been controlled by Japan before and during World War II. So after this, we do see many countries gain independence. This is a period called decolonization. And again, this is something we'll get into more in our next unit. But when we look at countries and when they gain independence, we see a lot of countries in the same areas gain independence around the same time. And that is largely due to the impact of World War II, because once these countries had been colonies of European powers, and then the Japanese controlled them for years or decades. Once the Japanese are forced to leave due to their surrendering at the end of World War II, now these former colonies, they get to attempt to declare independence for themselves. Some of this is successful, peaceful transfers of power, like in places like Malaysia and Singapore. And in other areas, we see conflict in places such as Indonesia and what will become Vietnam, because some European powers are willing to give up their colonies, and that's largely due not because they're just being nice and they realize the wrongness of their actions, but more because they do not have the infrastructure, they don't have the resources to maintain their colonies. So some willingly give up because they realize they just don't have the resources to maintain colonialism any longer. And other European powers, they are still going to try to cling to their power. So the Dutch and the French, and to a lesser extent the British, they will try to recolonize the lands. But as we know, they are unsuccessful because all of these regions ultimately gain independence. And again, a little spoiler for our next unit, we'll talk about it more in greater detail. But it is important to note that these countries, many of them become democracies, many of them also choose to turn to communism, as we'll see, but most of them have very little experience, because even though they had been independent states prior to colonization, that period of colonization destroyed their records, destroyed a lot of their infrastructure. So when they have the opportunity, when they take the opportunity to gain independence again, their knowledge is incredibly limited, and they are at a great disadvantage. So this is going to lead to instability and more conflict, just like we saw in Europe after World War I, when we see these countries forming democracies for the first time and we see them struggle. We see this happen in Asia, and spoiler alert, we'll also see it happen in Africa, which is our other region that will gain independence at this time. But before we get to that, we need to understand how people are responding to this war, because the war is over, we're seeing a lot of rebuilding, but there were also an immense number of crimes. This is truly the war in which there has been the most depravity of humans, in which we've seen the greatest loss of human life. And there are many perpetrators of these crimes, and these perpetrators must be shown justice for the victims, for the world's sake. So we see in the response to war, we see two major trials that occur, and these are months, years of trials that occur in these two areas. In Nuremberg, trying the Nazis on these crimes against humanity, and in Tokyo, trying the Japanese war criminals. So why do we see Nuremberg being chosen? If you remember when we learned about the Holocaust, One of the major events that led to the legitimization of ultimately violence and terror against Jews was first the legitimization of discriminatory laws. These were the Nuremberg laws that were written in 1935. This is where we see Jews not being allowed to hold certain jobs, Jews not being able to marry German people, Jews not allowing to have citizenship, restriction of movement, restriction of freedoms, etc. This happened in Nuremberg. Nuremberg was also iconically famous for having large Nazi rallies. There is a documentary that is used somewhat in quotations because it really is a propaganda film called The Triumph of the Will that documented a major rally that occurred in Nuremberg. And it is one of the more infamous events in Nazi history. So Nuremberg was very specifically chosen to try Nazis on for their crimes, and then Tokyo was chosen to try the Japanese. Now, many Nazis do die by suicide. They unalive themselves to avoid punishment as well as escape to foreign countries. Some are successful and move to places like Argentina, etc. And some are caught and brought back to trial. And that is still happening. I think it was just last year that there was a woman that was put to trial because she was someone who worked in one of the big concentration camps. I think it was Birkenau. And she was one that kept all the records and was very intrinsic to the perpetuation of violence and inhumanity. And she was just put to trial and punished for her crimes just last year. So these people, when they're put on trial, they are accused of waging wars of aggression and committing crimes against humanity. This is a new concept, this crimes against humanity. This is not just you fought a battle. This is not just you sank a ship with a U-boat. This is not just you used gas in combat. This is a crime against humanity because the perpetuation of violence and devastation and destruction and depravity was so extreme that they needed to have a new concept. They needed to have a new way of speaking about this. So this crime against humanity is truly the worst thing that someone can be accused of and held responsible for. It's something that we still use to this day. These trials also create the foundation for the Geneva Convention, which in subsequent years defines the concept of genocide. Genocide is the intentional killing of a group of people en masse due to an aspect of their identity. So it could be due to someone's religious identity, someone's national, ethnic, racial identity, gendered identity, or so on and so forth. If people are targeted en masse because of their identity, if they are killed en masse because of their identity, this is a genocide. Genos for people, side means killing, in the same way that patricide is killing your father, patra, father, side, killing again. So this creates both the concept of genocide as well as the terms of punishment for those who perpetuate genocide and other crimes against humanity. So that's one first response to the war, of punishing those that perpetuated these horrific crimes. In addition, there is a real push to prevent these types of events from happening again in the future. So we see new global organizations that are going to be created. The goals of these global organizations is to build connections, cooperations, and to prevent war from happening. One of the biggest global organizations that is still around to this day is the United Nations. It was founded just a month after World War II officially ended. It was initially created by the Allied powers. Initially, it started with 51 member states. It's now up to 193 member states. Yes, South Sudan was in 193rd. So of the 195 countries in the world right now, 193 are member states of the United Nations. You have the Vatican City that was a member state, and now they are just, I believe they have observer status. And then Palestine is the other country that does not have member status, but instead they are observer status, and that is due to the fact that Palestine has not been given sovereignty by Israel, who considers it part of the occupied territories, and that is a much more complicated story that we will definitely talk about in greater detail as the semester begins. Back to the United Nations, they have two goals: peace and protect human rights. That's it. They want to maintain peace and they want to protect human rights of people. One could argue that they're successful because we've avoided a third world war. One could argue that they've been very unsuccessful because there have been many conflicts that have occurred since then. That's up for you to decide on just how effective you think the United Nations is, and something I do encourage you to think about. Just a little bit more about the United Nations. Some of the major organizations of it, we have the General Assembly members. That's 193 members. They meet, actually meet in New York City. That's their headquarters. And that's where they make decisions. That's where they hear from representatives of states and, do the order of business that is global cooperation. We have their National Court of Justice. They try international criminals. So if you are being accused of crimes against humanity, if you've done something that is so egregious, so depraved, etc., then you go to the International Court of Justice to go through the due process of law, etc. And then we have the Security Council. The Security Council, they're the ones that are really resolving conflicts and really making actions and judgments on the actions of the member states. There are 5 permanent members that are on the Security Council, and you might notice some commonalities here. Our 5 permanent members are United States, Great Britain, at the time, the Soviet Union, France, and China. And who are those countries? Those are the major allied powers that win World War II. So when the United Nations is created, they have the power. They're going to put themselves in this position of power. They are permanent members. They have been members ever since, with the exception being the Soviet Union that then subsequently turned into Russia in 1991. We'll talk about it. In addition to these 5 permanent members, you have 10 more members that represent the Asia-Pacific region, Africa, Central and South America, and Eastern Europe that sit on the Security Council for a year term. So right now we have Ecuador, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, and Switzerland are non-permanent members that their term just ended. And the non-permanent members that are coming in are going to be South Korea, Algeria, Sierra Leone, Guyana, and Slovenia will be joining them. And if you're wondering yourself, like, well, the United Nations are all about making peace and, protecting human rights. And then we see things like the annexation and invasion of Ukraine. Why didn't the United Nations do more? Well, again, one of the security members, one of the permanent members is Russia. So you can see how that becomes very concerning and problematic. If we're China to invade Taiwan, it'd be very difficult for the United Nations to then speak out against it because China is also a permanent member. So this is where things get very sticky and complicated with global geopolitics. Other things about the United Nations, we have UNICEF, UNESCO, and the World Health Organization, one that we have been hearing a lot about since the pandemic. So they are also there to help humanity attempt to thrive and prosper. So that's a little bit about the geopolitical organizations that are created, but we also have some economic organizations. We have the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And the goals of the IMF and the World Bank are to help negotiate trade between nations, help developing nations grow and prosper by giving out loans, etc. And while they do this, and the idea behind this is if countries are economically successful, that will lead to less instability and less frustrations. When countries are experiencing economic frustration, etc., it leads to instability, it leads to people questioning their government. So if we think about in recent years, we've been having economies that have been struggling, and we've seen the rise of populism, we've seen the rise of people turn to authoritarian governments throughout the world. That is largely in response to poor economies. So the idea between the IMF and the World Bank, make economies good, people are happy, more stability politically, humanity, etc. So that's one good thing that they aim to do. But because the countries that largely created this came from a region of the world that had been benefiting from the trade, from the dynamics between the Western world and the developing world, the IMF and the World Bank, they do also perpetuate these dynamics in which the Western world is where the majority of the manufacturing occurs from the Industrial Revolution to today. And the resources primarily come from the developing world of our former colonies of Asia, Africa, to a lesser extent South Africa or South America, and the Middle East. So it really reinforces this unbalanced relationship that developed nations that had been in positions of power since going all the way back to 1750. Think about the start of our class. That this is one of the reasons why they still maintain so much economic power, because these imbalances still exist. So finally, to wrap things up, after World War II, the world has been forever changed. We know that through the immense loss of life. We knew that through the new governments that are created. We see institutions are having to rebuild, having to repair from the destruction of war. We see people around the world really questioning their former beliefs of progress and growth. So thinking back all the way to the Enlightenment and this belief in progress, that humanity, through more learning, through more education, through more acquisition of knowledge, they can improve themselves. And they are able to develop new technologies that can serve humanity. But what we see with World War I and then very much with World War II, these new technologies perpetuate more efficient killing, more efficient terror, more efficient destruction of humanity. So are we really progressing? People really question that. And just like we saw with the lost generation following World War I, we see people once again lose their sense of self, lose their beliefs. People really question religion. How can you have a God or a higher power that would allow something like the Holocaust to happen? It's something that people really grapple with. And as we continue to experience devastation and loss, thinking about what's going on in our world, places like Gaza, Sudan, Congo, and elsewhere, it is hard to continue to have faith, and a lot of people really struggle with that. Yes, as I see there. And then finally, the last big shift that we're seeing is that economic and political power is starting to shift away from Europe. It's moving west. This is because Europe has lost a lot of their wealth due to the fact that they had to spend, I think something like $4 trillion was spent in World War II. European powers have majority lost their colonies, which were some of their major areas of wealth and their resources. They are losing. They've lost their global dominance. They have to rebuild. They have to spend so much energy and effort into just literally building buildings again and building that infrastructure. But there's one country that won World War II and has to do none of that. They didn't lose their colonies. They only have to rebuild one naval base. And beyond that, they come out of this war looking real good. And that is, of course, the United States. And this really is going to set up the United States as being the defender and leader of the free world, and really set up a period of true domination by the United States in the post-war world, as we'll get to in our upcoming weeks. So congratulations, you made it through this lecture, and I will see you in class soon. Have a great day. Bye.